We do have a very esteemed guest with us today. He, I can imagine, is a very, very, very busy man given the current climate. So very a big thank you to coming on to the platform there. Before I go into introduce you, just early gardening that we'll need to do here. So if you are listening to this on the Spotify or Apple Podcast, make sure you drop a like or a review. Watching on the YouTube, make sure you like the video and make sure you subscribe to the channel. That will do us a lot of favors there. So I'm not going to introduce Tapin Tobes and Stevie. Like everyone knows you, everyone is used to you. But Sanjay, thank you very much for coming on to the podcast. As chairman of Kick It Out, we are. It's our pleasure to have you on, and we're sure this is going to be a great episode.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, Sanjay.
No problem. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks. And just to kick off today, then, basically, Sanjay, what I thought would be great is if you could just give us some background to yourself. You know, where you started in your career, how you've ended up in your current role as chairman of Kick It Out.
Yeah, so I always just think that the best things in life kind of happen by accident, and they're sort of glorious accidents. And in a way, this is a bit of a glorious accident for me. So my career, nothing really to do with football. I've done bits and pieces in football, but really nothing to do with football. I was a lawyer actually for 30 years and worked in the city, but really it's split in half and half. The first half I was actually practicing as a lawyer. I practiced in white-collar crime, in international fraud, so tracing assets around the world, any big major fraud right back to the big banking collapses in the early 90s. So the first case I worked on was collapse of a bank in the 90s worth about $8 billion. At that time, was the biggest banking collapse ever. And then my career flipped midway through technology. Really, I helped to write the English court rules on how we deal with electronic evidence, and so then I built businesses around technology, and then that expanded more into sort of markets roles and into chief innovation officer type roles. But I'd always had this side hustle in other things that I did. So when I was younger in my career, I used to represent prisoners on death row in Trinidad, and then I was a partner at EY for the last 12 years of my career. Whilst I was there, I led race strategy in the UK for a few years, and we had some really good successes there. And then off the back of that, I'd also been working with the government on the Parker Review on ethnicity into UK boards. And then off the back of that, when the Premier League was looking for panellists for its equality standard to assess all the Premier League clubs, I was invited to become one of those panellists. And so I had 4 years with the Premier League assessing all the Premier League clubs for their equality standards. And so when I was coming to the end of my career and decided I wanted to do something else because I like doing lots and lots of different things, the role at Kick It Out became available, and so I was encouraged to apply for it. I'd come across Kick It Out because they were supporting a lot of the clubs, the Premier League clubs, when they're going through the equality standard, and so I was encouraged to apply. I applied, and well, that's how I'm here now. So,
right. Thank you. Very
circuitous route. It wasn't a direct route into
and to be honest, it sounds quite encouraging that someone who's had an experience doing lots of other things outside football, can then bring that into the role within football. Because I think a lot of the time the people at the top of football organisations have got quite limited experiences. So I think that's that's definitely a good thing.
My experience of football. So I've not been in the football industry in the sense I've not been employed by football, but I've been in the football industry because I've been a football fan since 1974, and I've been going home and away to support my team for over 30 years. So I'm a Man United supporter. So
we might need to end the stream now.
Yeah, but you learn things when you're going to games home and away every week for 30 odd years. That's a commitment, and it just seems really odd if people think that you're not in the football industry. We go, well, I seem to put quite a lot of money and effort into it, and I seem to be involved in it every week, and I think about it every day. So yeah, and sometimes as fans we get forgotten about by football. But you know what? There is no football without fans, and you'll see that with empty stadia and what Pep was saying last night. It's players and fans. That's what football's all about.
Yeah, for sure. And how have you found the role now that you've been there for a short amount of time? And sort of what are your main goals that you're setting out to achieve as an organisation now?
Yeah, so I joined in sort of September, October time, and we had a few things that we were working on, sort of tidying up from that had been in existence for a while. Governance review that we've been doing. I launched a strategic review of the entire organisation, and we're just sort of taking that through our boards and our funders and so on, slightly slowed down by COVID-19. That's impacting all of us with the finances of football being impacted. But during that process, the most important part of the strategic review from my perspective was I was keen on getting the views, obviously, of all the team and respecting to all the members of our team. But more importantly is going out and talking to all the people we're meant to represent and going out and talking to other people. And so I conducted this listening tour, and I've met between 200 and 250 people from over 70 different organisations to get feedback on not just what have we been doing, what works, what doesn't work. More importantly, if you had a blank sheet of paper, what would you want Kick It Out to do now? Because it's different. You know, football is different now to when it was set up in 1993. So what do you actually want from us? And I've got some relatively clear ideas on that. I can't sort of announce all of that now because we need to formally announce the new strategy, but we're pretty clear on what we want to do. I think what I can say is some of the things that I've talked about earlier this week in the Times and I've talked about in previous interviews, which is that we need someone, I think, to bring football together because footballs can be quite fragmented and siloed. And so I think there's a role for us in that, and there's a role for someone, and I think that's a role that we can fulfill. I think the other thing is we're going to need to embrace data and technology much more. We're in a completely different world now, and particularly with things like managing online abuse, you can't apply analog solutions to the digital problem. We've got to apply digital solutions. So being more tech savvy, more focused on the data, and we talked a little bit about the pilot program we're running with an AI company around how we're going to try and monitor social media for online abuse.
That's really good.
That sounds really interesting. Yeah, I was going to say, because at the minute, obviously, Twitter is a quite free-for-all kind of platform, and you see a wide range of sort of wild comments going on in there. It's not really policed at the minute. So it'd be really interesting to see what kind of work Kick It Out can do around that, and how much sort of power you'll be given to sort of police and monitor that, because I think if you look at some of the abuse that's happened of late, and I don't know if this has been a shift or just because of the acceleration of the use of social media. We're just seeing it much more now, but it just seems over the last few years, the racism seems to be getting worse on social media, in the grounds as well. And sort of leading on to that, I wanted to ask your perspective on how sort of football's changed from, obviously you've been going to games for 30 odd years now, how football's changed over the years, and currently, like I was saying, it seems the last few years or so, the racism issues have really sort of been at the fore of football. I wanted to ask your perspective on why do you think that's happened, and are we just sort of bringing to light what was already existing, or has there been some issues that are now being exacerbated?
So I think there's probably two elements to that question, really, which is, you know, where are we, and is it worse or better over a period, and if it is worse or better, why? So I think the first question, one of the things I would encourage people to think about is to stop thinking in straight lines, right, and to start thinking in cycles. So, you know, my experience, and I'm old enough to remember back to the mid-70s, is that is society and football now better than it was in 1974, the first few years when I can remember football? It is infinitely better than it was in the early 1970s and the late 1970s. It's so much better. But has it got worse over the last 5 or 6 years? Definitely. So we're better than we were in 1974, but we're worse than we were in 2012. And I use 2012 as the kind of high watermark because of the Olympics, because what an amazing feeling of unity and cohesion there was in this country after the Olympics. And I think the reason why I say you have to think about these things in cycles is it's a bit like the stock market, isn't it? You know, if you look at the stock market closely, the price is quite volatile. It goes up and down, up and down, up and down. But actually over the long period, it's a gradual upward trend. And I think it's quite similar with discrimination and racism. Actually, it's a gradual, if you look at the whole trend over 30 years, it's a downward trend. But if you look quite closely, there's peaks and troughs. And we're having an upward inflection. My experience is that upwards inflections actually correlate pretty closely with the economy. This is a socio-economic problem. It's not a football problem. It is a football problem in the sense that football is a lightning rod for society. And so we experience things in football maybe more acutely and more quickly than we do elsewhere. But these reflect societal problems. So if you go back to all the big recessions, they're nearly always followed by periods of, you know, unemployment or economic problems, and therefore looking for people to blame. Guess who gets blamed? It's always the minorities. Okay, so 1974 oil shock, recession, mid to late 70s problems. 1979 recession, early 80s. Brixton riots, all the other things that were going on. I was from the West Midlands, the Handsworth riots. You know, really then you go through to, I suppose, 1990 was the next one, and then you get little blips after that, although it wasn't quite so bad in the early 90s. And then you had relatively benign economic conditions until 2008. And then I suppose what's been different since 2008 is society has changed. So you've got this polarization of society, you've got the adoption of technology, you've got the money going much more to smaller communities. So the disparity between the rich and the poor is much, much bigger than it's ever been. And then people also in their sort of little social media bubbles. And so, and then this breakdown in trust in our politicians, the breakdown in trust in our leaders from things like MPs' expenses, the Iraq invasion of Iraq, from the financial crisis. All these things cause a breakdown in trust, and so or a shift in the axis of trust, because we no longer trust our leaders, but we trust other people who are like us and give us recommendations, which is what social media taps into. It's what Amazon taps into. We trust the recommendations from our friends. And so actually what you've got is a society that's much more polarized, and we're all in our little bubbles. And actually we no longer engage with people's ideas. What we do is, you're in a different bubble to me, so I'm just going to criticize you because you're a member of that bubble, irrespective of the ideas. And that is a place where hate can foster. So a long, complicated answer, because I think it's the simple thing is say, you know, racism is worse or better. It's definitely worse than it was 7 years ago. It's definitely worse than it was 4 or 5 years ago. It's better than it was 30 years ago. There has been progress over 30 years. But we can't assume that, yeah, just because it's better than it was 30 years, we're never going to go back to a really terrible position. You could, and we could. So we have to do things, and we have to use the impetus from Black Lives Matter and George Floyd for change. Now's the time for action.
Yeah, I was gonna mention, Sanjay, on the sort of situation we're in now with regards to the heightened increase in racism, not just in football, but I feel like it's happening globally. Do you think politics also have a part to play in that as well? Yeah. Because right now in the UK, I mean, the leaders, the people who we look to for inspiration and direction, there are people who have actually made the most ignorant comments, any sort of potential racial remarks as well, bigot related comments as well. So it's like these are the leaders that we follow as a nation, and essentially if these are their views, then of course I think I don't want to call them puppets, but the people who are easily influenced by these so-called leaders essentially adopt the same views as them, and I feel like that also spills into football as well. So that's why I wanted to ask: do you think politics also plays a part in this as well?
Definitely. The tone of politics, the tone of the rhetoric, the language that people use. I would urge politicians to be careful in the language they use, because that's used as a shelter for other people for their racist behaviour and their actions. And actually, and this is not a specific thing about UK politics, actually, because this is a global trend. It's part of this polarisation, and actually, politics is almost no longer about left and right. It's about open or closed. Which is why the Tories can do so well in the northern heartlands of Labour, because this is about people feeling like they're outsiders, and it's are you open to globalism and so on, or are you a bit more closed? And that really seems to be the theme in politics, and that does play to identities quite strongly. And so, of course, because politicians have had this breakdown in trust, they're now looking, where can I find it? Well, I can find it by appealing to a particular group or a particular base. And that isn't just happening here. That's Bolsonaro in Brazil. That's Erdogan in Turkey. It is Trump. It's happening all over the world. And, of course, we're getting a small microcosm of it around Brexit and all the other things that we've had in this country. But, yeah, the language that politicians use, definitely I would urge them to be more tempered on both sides. And I'm not playing party politics, because there are allegations and in both major political parties where they've had some challenges around discriminatory behaviour, and so being careful with language is incredibly important.
I think the most disappointing thing for me, though, is because I feel like with these people in power, it always seems more often than not that it's predominantly football fans that adopt these views about the minority the minority ethnicities as well. Yeah. And I think I read a book a while back about how Margaret Thatcher, when she was Prime Minister, she adopted similar sort of tactics to actually win the masses over in regards to actually getting herself into Downing Street in the first place. And I feel now more than ever that it's disappointing but not surprising that it's always typically more often than not football fans that always harbor these views. And my question to you is, how do we get in a position where we sort of change their thinking as to how they view ethnic minorities?
Yeah, I'm not sure Maggie Thatcher actually used football fans, because Maggie Thatcher hated football fans, and she
no, not football fans. I meant she used the
language. I know you mean.
She used the sort of the whole nationalism approach to actually get herself into power.
Yeah, but now what we have is this sort of these populist movements, and I'm not sure football actually. It's really difficult to be certain on the data that football has any more of a problem than the rest of society, and so it's just that people have interests, and football is one of their interests. And football, in effect, look, football is our national religion. It would be like 200 years ago saying it's Catholicism or Protestantism or whatever, because actually everyone had a belief. Now everyone has a belief, but it's actually a football shirt. And so I was talking to a club earlier this week, and they were talking about an incident doing some of this monitoring. They're going, part of the challenge we have is we'll see someone, there'll be a comment that will come online on social media, and it'll be from a fan, and they're wearing our team shirt. But when we do the check, they've never been to a game, and they live the other side of the world. But of course, that looks like it's a football fan that's representing an abhorrent view, but they may not be. They've never been to a game. It's just they've somehow got an allegiance there. Now, and then maybe there's a difference when you're going into grounds. Now, in terms of changing people's minds and opinions, I think in football we have to do the same as we have to do in the rest of society, which is ultimately this is about education, but that goes across all parts of the problem, whether you're preventing incidents from happening, detecting them happening, and reacting to them. education's a kind of golden thread that runs through all of that, all the way through to, we've been running fan rehabilitation education programs, so that as an alternative to being banned, we will offer those fans, you can get a shorter ban if you go through a rehab program, so you can understand the impact of your behaviours. Now, of course, that's not going to apply to everyone. There's going to be the hardened extremists who are that's never going to apply to. But as I think, as you were saying in your question, Toby, actually, there's quite a lot of people who are just highly suggestible. And guess what? We have to get them and suggest them the right path rather than the wrong path. So, I was talking earlier this week with someone to think about how can you get people much earlier in that journey. So, again, using the data and how can we then use education.
Yeah, I wanted to touch on something that you said earlier about it not being necessarily racism, not necessarily being a problem within football, but it's a problem within society, and that always sorts of rubs me up the wrong way a little bit when I hear that kind of thing, because I just feel like if we're trying to define society, right, it's made up of all of these different organizations, and the focus should really be on, well, if we're talking about football, let's get football's house in order, and that's one less place in society that people like someone who does hold these racist or bigoted views can be comfortable in. And then if everyone else focuses on getting their own houses in order, you then have very, very few places within society where someone can feel comfortable to be racist. And I think you hear like someone like John Barnes or something who seems to get all of the coverage, saying all these things, and then you get people then repeating that, saying, "Oh no, this isn't football's problem. There's nothing that football can do." When actually, when you look at what someone like Marcus Rashford has done this week, it shows that football can have a massive influence into the policy that's happening across the country. So I definitely feel that if it's possible, the fight against racism is something 100% that the Premier League and other football organisations can 100% be at the forefront of, and help to make change in the country. I was reading the article. I think Henry.
Maybe I should just clarify that, because what I mean by saying it is a societal problem. What I'm saying is it's not football's problem alone. I suppose I kind of treat it like family. As I'm a fan and I've been following this sport all my life, and I sometimes feel like it's really cheap and it's easy particularly for politicians, to use football as a lightning rod for all the anger of society and go, well, it's a football problem. It's not. It is a societal problem. But the great thing about football is actually we can be a beacon for change because it is so influential. And so it's almost like, well, I'm part of the football family. If you're going to try and put the blames of society, blame all society's ills on me and my family, well, I'm kind of going to protect the family because I'm part of the family. But you don't tell my family, you don't tell, my nephew this or my brother this. I'll tell him that. That's my job, right? But inside the family, I'm going to be campaigning for change, and I'm saying, well, we can be better than this. We've got to do better. We have to be a beacon for society. So I think football can and should be doing more. As if you see, you're talking about the article, plenty of ideas on what we should be doing more of.
Toby, go for it.
Yeah, sorry, I was going to say, so on the topic of doing more, Sanjay, I think myself, Steve, and Dan, we've spoken with some of our mates in the past about, because it seems like it's a never-ending cycle, especially over the last 2-3 year period, where a big incident happens in football, it gets condemned but it gets condemned all over social media, it gets condemned by journalists and people high up in football, and then we see some sort of initiative from the Premier League in coordination with yourselves, and then I feel like maybe a month or 2 months time it all gets forgotten about. It's either that or something happens and the actual actions as a result of that aren't really significant enough. And what I wanted to ask you, I know obviously there are probably things you're working on which you may not be able to divulge on now, but how do we get to a point where people actually sort of respect a lot of the initiatives which come out of these atrocities?
So I think you're right. Actually, I think what happens is we go through a sort of rinse and repeat process, don't we? An incident happens, everyone gets angry about it. It's a really complex problem. So everyone offers their own favourite simple solution to a hugely complex problem, shouts that at you, and then they forget about it because they're not involved in the solution, and then they walk away, and then another incident happens, and they come back and go, I told you what the answer was to that last time, didn't I? Why haven't you done that? Well, because actually, guess what? Your really simple answer was part of the answer, but it's not the whole of the answer. It's a complex problem. We have to deal with all these things, which is why, what I want to see in response to this, and this feels slightly different. This feels different. I think there's a mood that's different. Is we have to see sustained action, and we have to see this different action. I'm not going to judge you on your words. Great, I'll take the gestures. That's important, and take the gestures that they keep pressure on people, but you got to keep the gestures going because they have to keep. You need to maintain the pressure, but we need to see the action. So we need to see targets being set. We need to see processes to ensure that those targets are met over a period. That's initially a 5-year journey. That is not we'll introduce a one-off initiative. So that's my big fear when you get a big event, is that people get frightened and then they go for a really high-profile PR exercise. That's not a solution. Solutions are difficult and complex and take time. So if you're involved, and if you got involved because of recent events, you need to stay involved. You have to be part of the solution. Don't be a commentator. Be a contributor.
Yeah, and from my perspective, over the years, it seems like the FA, in my opinion, is a little bit of an old white boys club. There's very little black representation there, and they seem to have a certain way of doing things. In terms of your interactions with them, how encouraged are you, or how encouraged do they seem to be in terms of moving away from how they've typically done things? And are you seeing like sort of a real drive from them to change? And then on the back of that question as well, I think from footballers as well, I look at other sports. So if you look at the NBA, for instance, you see basketballers rather, voicing their opinions much more. And I feel that the environment we've created in football, certainly in England, means that footballers aren't really allowed to express themselves, and they've been quite confined in what they're sort of allowed to say. Do you encourage the sort of change in that approach from footballers? We're seeing a bit more now with Sterling coming up and speaking up, and Tyrone Mings as well. How do you sort of see that changing, and what sort of support are you offering for those guys?
So I think I'll do. So the first question on the FA, my own experiences of them over the last 7, 8, 9 months is actually similar to quite a lot of people in football, which is everyone wants to actually says all the right things, and I genuinely believe that they want to do the right things. But it's partly these are really complex problems, and there are no simple solutions. But I think I'm encouraged by the conversation we've had over the last couple of weeks. In particular, I don't know if you've seen the letter that Paul Elliott sent out today and that Greg Clark endorsed. I think there's a real mood for change, and I think that comes right from Greg as the chair and Mark Bullingham as the CEO. And whenever I speak to Mark, and I've spoken to him quite regularly, it matters to him. This matters to him to change. And so I think they genuinely want to drive that change, and they've been receptive to me and to other people providing ideas. Obviously, we need to come good on the words. So, but so far, I'm encouraged. I think I've had good interactions with them, and I feel like they want to do the right things. And been working with Paul this week on the thing that he sent out today. That I was a signatory on that letter. I think in terms of players using their platforms, I think it's kind of the genie's out of the bottle anyway, because it's there with social media. So Raheem's, isn't Cristiano Ronaldo the first footballer to be a billionaire? Well, guess what? He didn't get that just from playing the sport. He got that from all his Instagram followers and commercializing that and commercializing his following. That is the business model for many footballers, is gaining the following so that you can monetize it. They are massively influential, as Raheem Sterling has shown, as Marcus Rashford has shown. Really admire what Tyrone Mings did actually going on the protest march. These are all people with great voices. Troy Deeney, they're all people with voices and opinions. I think it's brilliant that they're doing it and that they've got the platform. And I think the genie's out of the bottle. I don't think you can stop them doing it now. And fair play to them and all more power to them. I'd support them. I don't. You know what? They don't need my support. I need their support. They got a bigger platform than me. I need to prove myself worthy of them supporting me, not the other way around. They're bigger than me. They're bigger than my organisation.
Yeah. If we go back to your to the Times article that came out on Monday, and just walk through some of those targets that have actually been outlined in that article. So I think it was something like all clubs set a target that by 2025, 20% of the board will be people of colour. 25% of the coaching staff will be people of colour. Link director bonuses and pay to achieving diversity targets. Clubs report ethnicity pay gaps, and there's a long list of these types of targets. What's the reception been to those targets that have been set? Because I think when that was published, it was interesting just reading the comments, underneath that, where people are shouting tokenism, or that's reverse racism, that's discrimination. What do you say back?
Equality.
What do you say back to those people as well?
What I say that back to those people is what I say back to those people all the time, is that if you've been used to privilege, equality feels like oppression. Right? We're not after privilege, we're after equality. I'd say, so when someone challenged me, said, it should be on merit, going, well, there's no such thing as a meritocracy. There's nothing meritocratic. No, if you think there's any job anywhere in the world, any business which is a pure meritocracy, you're living in a fantasy, because there's always discretion in when you employ people. There's always choices of people, and people exercise discretion. And when they exercise that discretion, they often exercise it based on their own identity and who they are. And we all look for ourselves in other people and the networks that we know. And football kind of is quite old-fashioned, but it's not the only industry like this. I've seen this in other industries where it's full of informal networks, and that's the way people get jobs. But if you think that 30% of players are black and 4% of coaches, or they're different statistics, but hovers around the 4 to 5% mark. That's a massive statistical anomaly. I think what then. You just explain that to me then. One of my responses was to someone who said we should just carry on with what we're going. Yeah, you're right. We should carry on with 96% white coaches then, shouldn't we? Because that seems completely fair, given the game that's got 30% of black players. And you're telling me that talent is not distributed evenly for them to be a coach. Talent is distributed evenly. Opportunity is not. That's the difference.
And I always think that, because people come to the defense of football and say, look how many black players you have. There's no discrimination there. How can you say football's racist? But then I almost feel like that almost backs it up, because it's almost like you're saying that we're good enough to run around and be strong and use our physicality and our athleticism. But then when it comes to using our brains, we're then all of a sudden the excuse, black coaches, they're clearly not good enough for the job, or something like that. And it's just like, you're almost reinforcing those stereotypes by saying, right, they're good enough to play, but they're not good enough to teach others how they should play.
That's exactly, it's all the unconscious biases that are in there that are embedded in, and people think because it looks fair on the pitch that therefore it's okay. Well, you would expect those people to make it through into the coaching. So there's something going wrong. There are some informal networks. There's probably some unconscious bias going on. Guess what? That'll tell you the pitch isn't fair either. Because if it were, there'd be more people who look like me on it. We're the biggest ethnic minority. Asians are the biggest ethnic minority in this country. It's 42 years since Viv Anderson made his debut as the first black player for England. We're still waiting. Where's that pipeline? Right, so there are probably unconscious biases happening at the scouting and the academy level that are stopping people coming through. There are some assumptions that are being made in the same way that I remember those times 30 or 40 years ago when black players were coming through and they said, well, yeah, they might be able to play in certain positions, but they can't be a centre-half and they can't be a captain and they won't be any good in the winter. It's one of the really big things why that West Brom Man United game when Laurie Cunningham and Cyril Ridge was so fantastic at Old Trafford in December 78 is such a big moment because it was in the snow. And people said black people can't play in the snow. And it's my team, but they wiped the floor with us. You know, and Laurie Cunningham was one of my all-time favourite players, was absolutely magnificent that day. But those kind of unconscious biases that we had about black people as players in the 70s, you're getting it as black people as coaches, and you're almost certainly getting it as Asian people as players, young Asians as players, that there are some different unconscious biases. So we're constantly having to, take the layers off the onion. It mutates. The problem mutates.
And is there specific things that is being done at the moment to sort of tackle that barrier to entry that sort of Asian players are feeling? Because I think even from, when we've been growing up, there have been a few players who have been like of Asian descent and who have been by far and away of the better players that we've been playing with. And yet, you'd really expect them to then kick on and make it. And you've seen others who weren't anywhere near as talented make that step up without them. So is there anything being done at that level to sort of tackle that?
I know there are things like the FA's Asian Inclusion Plan, but I'll be honest, I haven't got under the bonnet of all the things that are going on. I've had some feedback that have been given to me during the listening tour that I've been doing, particularly around the experiences of Asian people at academies and scouting. And so, but I think again, I'll go back to just look at the numbers, right? The numbers tell you a story. I don't have to come up with the reasons. Football has to tell me. You have to explain that massive statistical anomaly. It's a massive anomaly. So you tell me what's wrong, but actually you solve it. I can give you a hypothesis that something's probably happening at the bottom there, that people are making some assumptions about Asian people, and we hear the words that are sometimes used. That's probably having an impact. That's probably what's partly causing this problem.
I was gonna mention Sanjay as well on because one of the objectives as well that was outlined was to sort of build on the EFL's sort of Rooney rule, and I wanted to ask because from the outside looking in, it seems as if like obviously they're separate entities, but how do we get to a stage where sort of the FA, EFL, the Premier League are sort of joined up in terms of thinking? Because I can't for the life of me understand why the EFL would implement that rule, but yet for some reason or another we don't see that rule implemented at the Premier League level. I don't really understand why there's such a disconnect there, and I don't really get why any sort of discussion with regards to how the minorities are sort of handled within football is treated separately. It should be one universal sort of umbrella to cover just English or English football as a whole. I don't get why it's disjointed.
So I think the reason why it was started as an experiment in the EFL, there's some logic to it, which is it's traditionally a stepping stone for coaches going up through the ranks. So you start lower in the leagues and then go up to graduate up to being, maybe ultimately in the Premier League. So there's some logic to that, to starting in the EFL actually, if I can see that. And I know that there are still some challenges with the rule, and it needs some finessing. But look, the reality is, you can never bring something lock, stock, and barrel from another country and just lift it and shift it, because we have a different legal framework, we have different employment cultures. And it's a different sport. So it was never going to work exactly the same as it works in the US. That said, there's clearly some teething problems. It's a good, I always go, look, we'll start. You've done something, so it's a good start. It's a good start because you've started. But let's build on it. And if there are some challenges with it, right, where are those barriers? What's happening? So I think one of the cultures that we have, in particular in English football, I talked about the sort of the informal networks. I mean, part of that is also the sort of entourage. So when you hire in particular a first team coach, you're not just hiring the first team manager, are you? Because when the first team manager comes in, they go, I've worked with these 6 or 7 people. They're my mates. I've always worked with them, so they come with me. You know, it's like Mourinho used to have Rui Faria, didn't he? Doesn't have Rui Faria anymore. But you know, there's that they come as a unit, and so some of these strategies you have to do 2 things because there are these informal networks. You've got to disrupt the informal network, so that's the kind of stuff like having job specs and having interview quotas, trying to make those more formal open recruitment processes. And then the other thing is you penetrate the networks. So you, in those little cabals of 6 and 7 and 8 people, you bring someone in from outside who they mentor, and actually they become insiders. And it's going to be a combination of those 2 types of initiative that's going to eventually bring change. Does that give you a bit of a sense? I think the challenge is still there, but there's a logic to starting where they started. Yeah. But I think now we're at a point where we're probably ready for that. Actually, maybe we should have a broader adoption of this.
Yeah. That's why I brought up it. I just think it needs to be more wide scale, because more often than not, we see these organizations like the FA, like the Premier League, whenever these situations happen, they're at the forefront. They're the ones sending all these messages saying we don't condone this, we don't condone that, etc., etc. But it's like they're saying it without sort of acknowledging that within their own house specifically, there's that disparity in terms of minorities versus white people at board level, at coach level, etc., etc. So that's why I just thought there's just got to be some sort of joint up thinking there.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then I think finally, before we wrap up here, I just had one more question, and that's basically so given the current climate, you know, with the George Floyd murder that's happened, the widespread Black Lives Matter protests, you know, the widespread news coverage of the protests as well, is the feeling now that this is, you know, the tipping point and the time for real change to happen? And do you think that is something that can be achieved off the back of, you know, sort of the widespread attention that this is getting? Because obviously you're seeing, you know, every company under the sun, you know, post black squares on Instagram, make statements, this, that, and the other. But is now the time where we can see actual change happen?
It's always dangerous, isn't it, to predict that this is a tipping point, because, you know, we'll come back in a year's time and maybe it wasn't. I really hope it's a tipping point, but a tipping point in what? Let's put it in context. You know, this is this is like a 400-year war. You know, and Pep talked last night about 400 years. You know, and there's a reason for that. And so these are, you know, racism. Okay, I'll come back to. It is a societal problem. It's also an economic problem, all right? Because the origins of racism are in economics, all right? It was about the eugenics theories that were developed to support indentured slavery. It was the only way you could justify slavery was by saying, well, non-white people are inherently less intelligent than white people, and therefore we're a superior race. This was developed thinking that was specifically developed to justify slavery. So we've been in a 400-year war on this, and this is the latest battle. But it does feel like a tipping point in the latest battle, because there's this momentum, and there's this sense that it isn't black v white. There are some people that are clearly trying to opportunistically turn this into a race issue. But when the Daily Mail is saying it's everyone versus racists, it's not black v white, it's everyone v racists, then, you know, as a barometer for public feeling, when I think the Mail says something like that, that's the public feeling. So there is, to me, there really is an opportunity here to drive change. But, you know, because everyone has had this outpouring of emotion and support, we've got to turn that into action and say, Grace, we take your words and we take your gestures. Thanks for the support. What are you going to do? And so that was why I was really keen to set out, here are 20, 25 things you can do. You can do them. Are you going to put your money where your mouth is? We have to do them. There have to be actions. This has to be the point. Because my fear is, I'm posing the question: when you look back at this time in 5 years' time, are you going to look back and say this was the moment we changed, or like the Sex Pistols song, is it going to be just a cheap holiday in other people's misery? Because people like us and people like you'll have it differently to me. You'll experience it differently to me. We still get it. We'll still be getting this stuff when we walk down the street, or when we jump on it. If we ever jump on a train again, and you jump on a train and no one sits next to you, all that, yours is the last seat. The seat next to you is the last seat to go. All that kind of stuff. That's going to continue to happen. That's not just going to go overnight. So you have to gradually change these things. But this is the moment to do that change. This is the moment for action. So we've got to. We can't afford to be in a position in 5 years' time where we look back and say we fluffed the moment. This is the moment.
Right.
I fully agree.
Thank you. And that's a great statement to end the podcast on there. Thank you, Sanjay, again for coming on. Do you want to let listeners know where they can find you? Sorry, do you want to let the listeners know where they can find you on social media?
Yeah, if you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm on @Sanjay Kick It Out.
Thank you. And if you're still listening to us, make sure you follow us on TapIn Football across Twitter, Instagram. Leave a like and a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and make sure you like and subscribe to the YouTube channel as well. But again, Sanjay, thank you for coming on.
Sanjay. It's been a pleasure.
No worries. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolute pleasure to have you on. And we'll see you guys soon. Cheers.
Cheers.